What do you do when your worst enemy tries to destroy your dignity in open court? My uncle stood before the judge, demanding 100% of my mother's estate, entirely convinced I was just a broke tech support worker. He demanded my absolute surrender. He did not know the black wax-sealed envelope resting in my lap held a secret terrifying enough to make the most powerful judge in Texas stand at attention. Hello to our wonderful audience of Maya Revenge Stories, and thank you so much for your continued love and support. Sadly, YouTube has permanently disabled our channel's monetization, completely cutting off our operating budget, meaning we must stop uploading new videos here for the time being and transition our work over to Patreon. If you find today's story compelling, please consider supporting us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon community, where you will get access to even better, much longer, and incredibly detailed exclusive true stories featuring multiple emotional voice actors that we simply are not allowed to publish publicly on YouTube, which you can easily join by scanning the QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link conveniently located in the description and the pinned comments below. Now, let us begin today's incredible journey and step into the shoes of our main character, Lila Pena. The air conditioning in the penthouse law office high above downtown Austin, Texas, hummed with a quiet, expensive efficiency. Floor-to-ceiling tempered glass walls offered a panoramic view of the skyline, but my eyes remained fixed on the massive mahogany table in front of me. We were gathered for the final reading of my late mother's estate, a moment that should have been steeped in quiet mourning, but instead, the room was suffocating under the weight of sheer, unfiltered greed. Across the table sat my biological uncle, Marcus Thorne. Marcus was a self-proclaimed tech visionary and CEO, a man who wore his wealth like a weapon. He was draped in a custom-tailored Italian suit that likely cost more than my supposed yearly salary, his legs casually crossed in a posture of absolute arrogant certainty. He spent the first 20 minutes of the meeting checking his solid gold watch, practically vibrating with impatience. In his mind, this meeting was nothing more than a minor administrative hurdle. He was entirely convinced that he was about to be handed total executive control over the family's massive trust fund, along with a highly lucrative portfolio of proprietary tech patents my mother had developed. He looked at me not as a grieving daughter, but as a minor annoyance, a piece of dust he was about to brush off his perfectly pressed lapel. The estate lawyer, Mr. Harrison, adjusted his silver spectacles and broke the heavy silence. He began to read the final will and testament, his voice a steady, monotonous drone that belied the explosive nature of the words on the page. He listed the assets. There were commercial real estate holdings, massive stock portfolios, and the crown jewel of it all, the intellectual property rights that generated millions of dollars annually. Marcus leaned forward, an oily, triumphant smile spreading across his face, ready to claim his empire. Then, the atmosphere in the room violently shattered. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat and read the final, binding stipulation: total and absolute control of the trust fund, 100% of the financial assets, and sole executive authority over every single tech patent did not belong to Marcus. My mother had left it all, without exception, to me, Lila Pena. For exactly 3 seconds, the room was so quiet, I could hear the faint ticking of Marcus's obnoxious watch. His triumphant smile froze, then slowly contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. I exploded. Marcus slammed his open palms down on the thick glass center of the table with such terrifying force that the coffee cups rattled. His chair screeched backward against the polished marble floor. "This is a joke!" he roared, the veins in his neck bulging against his silk tie. "This is an absolute farce. You cannot be serious. Harrison, look at her." He pointed a manicured, trembling finger directly at my face, unleashing a torrent of venomous insults right there in the pristine office. "She is a worthless parasite, a complete and utter failure," he screamed, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You are going to hand a multi-million-dollar technology empire to a lowly IT help desk girl? She resets passwords for a living. She probably makes $15 an hour answering phones in some miserable cubicle. She does not even have the basic intellectual capacity to manage a grocery store, let alone a legacy of this magnitude. Through the entire verbal assault, I did not flinch. I maintained my perfectly upright posture, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I kept my face entirely devoid of emotion, projecting a mask of absolute icy indifference. I did not shed a tear. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I just sat there, absorbing his pathetic temper tantrum with the cold stillness of a statue. My total lack of reaction only pushed Marcus further into a state of psychotic fury. To a narcissist like him, silence was not strength. It was an admission of guilt. He genuinely believed I was sitting there paralyzed by fear, fully aware that I had somehow manipulated a dying woman and was now caught in the act. "You think you have won, you little fraud," he hissed, leaning over the table, his face inches from mine, his breath hot and reeking of expensive espresso. "You think you can just sit there and steal my company? I swear to God, Lila, I will drag you into the light. I am taking you to court. I will strip you of every single penny, and I will expose your pathetic, fraudulent existence to the entire world. By the time I am done with you, you will be begging to go back to your miserable little call center." He turned on his heel and stormed out of the glass doors, officially igniting a brutal, scorched earth legal war. Marcus Thorne thought he was dealing with a defenseless, easily crushed victim. He was entirely unaware that he had just declared war on a ghost, and that his own towering arrogance was about to become the very weapon that would utterly and permanently destroy him. To understand how we arrived at that explosive moment in the law office, you have to look back at the years of annual high society charity galas, velvet-roped banquets, and ostentatious holiday parties I was forced to attend. In the glittering, suffocating world of the Texas elite, I was never treated as a human being. I was a prop. I was the drab, unremarkable backdrop intentionally placed there to make my Uncle Marcus shine even brighter. Those evenings always played out the exact same way, following a script that Marcus had written in his own arrogant mind. He would hold court in the center of a grand ballroom beneath crystal chandeliers, surrounded by powerful venture capitalists, state politicians, and wealthy socialites, swirling $200 glasses of imported scotch. He loved the sound of his own voice, delivering self-righteous speeches about innovation, corporate dominance, and the ruthless nature of modern business. And whenever the conversation hit a lull, he would invariably drag me into the spotlight to serve as his favorite, reliable punchline. I would throw a heavy arm around my shoulder, squeezing just hard enough to trap me in place, and introduce me with a theatrical, condescending sigh. He would tell the room of millionaires about my supposedly miserable, invisible career, loudly mocking what he assumed was a literal starvation salary. He painted me as the tragic, unambitious niece who somehow lacked the family genius, a cautionary tale of wasted potential standing right there in a sensible dress. I distinctly remember one particular winter evening at a charity auction. It was a rare, fleeting moment where my carefully constructed guard slipped. I had just wrapped up a brutally exhausting, sleepless 72-hour operation, and my brain was running on fumes, when a polite, well-dressed investor asked how my week was going. I made the foolish mistake of mentioning that I had just successfully completed a massive, high-stakes project. Marcus did not miss a beat. He threw his head back and let out a booming, theatrical laugh that easily echoed over the live string quartet playing in the corner of the room. "A massive project?" he bellowed, ensuring every single person in a 50-foot radius paused to listen. "What did you do, Lila? Did you finally figure out how to unjam the heavy paper from the second-floor copy machine? Tell me, did your managers reward your breathtaking technical prowess with a $20 coffee gift card? Or did they give you a shiny gold star sticker to put on your cubicle wall?" The chorus of shallow, sycophantic laughter that immediately followed his joke still rings clear in my memory. I stood entirely still and watched my relatives, people draped in designer silk and custom tailoring, clutching their champagne flutes as they chuckled along with his cruel performance. Their eyes were entirely empty, completely devoid of any genuine substance or empathy. It was in that exact, humiliating second that a crystal-clear realization washed over my entire body. I saw the absolute vanity, the terrifyingly fragile egos, and the hollow, rotting core of their entire existence. They were completely desperate to feel superior, and they desperately needed me to be a failure to validate their own bloated self-worth. From that night onward, I made a conscious, unbreakable vow to lock my true identity far away from their prying eyes. I meticulously perfected the charade of absolute mediocrity. My family had no idea that my entire lifestyle was a carefully constructed, bulletproof mirage. They openly pitied the fact that I lived in a painfully generic, beige, two-bedroom apartment in a quiet suburban neighborhood, 45 minutes away from the city center. They genuinely thought I was poor and struggling to make ends meet. The reality was that I chose that mundane, unremarkable location specifically to cut off any unnecessary attention, completely isolating myself from their intrusive, gossiping social circles. They looked down on my scuffed shoes and my plain canvas bags. They especially looked down on the shabby, faded plastic employee badge I kept clipped to my belt. It looked like a generic identification card for a third-tier tech support company, complete with a terrible, unsmiling photograph and a peeling barcode. What Marcus and his wealthy sycophants did not know, and could never possibly comprehend, was the true nature of that faded piece of plastic. That flimsy ID card was actually a heavily encrypted, biometric key. It was the absolute sole mechanism required to bypass armed tactical guards and unlock heavily reinforced, military-grade steel vault doors hidden deep underground. My absolute silence over the years was never born out of weakness, fear, or submission. Every single time I swallowed an insult, every time I stood quietly while Marcus mocked my supposed incompetence, I was not cowering in defeat. I was exercising extreme discipline. My endurance was a cold, calculated resilience forged in the absolute darkest, most dangerous corners of the digital world. While Marcus was busy inflating his fragile ego in luxury country clubs and glass boardrooms, I was holding the line against catastrophic threats. I was a person entrusted with silent responsibilities so unimaginably heavy. They had the potential to shake the foundations of an entire nation. Letting a vain, arrogant man believe he was vastly superior was a remarkably small price to pay to protect the safety and security of millions of innocent lives. Behind the faded plastic badge and the monotonous suburban commute lay a reality that existed entirely off the grid. To reach my actual desk, I had to drive past an abandoned industrial park, enter a subterranean concrete parking structure, and pass through 4 separate biometric security checkpoints, including dual retinal scans and a dynamic voice print analysis. My actual workplace was a subterranean command center known only to a select, highly vetted few as the Aegis Sentinel Directive. If you tried to search for this organization on any public government database, corporate registry, or satellite map, you would find absolutely nothing but empty fields and redacted server error codes. We were a ghost agency. We were a highly classified, heavily militarized, rapid response cybersecurity coalition operating strictly under the absolute highest levels of federal executive clearance. I did not reset passwords for confused office workers, and I certainly did not fix jammed office printers. My official, classified title was Chief Cyber Defense Architect. While my arrogant uncle and his wealthy friends slept soundly in their sprawling gated communities, utterly oblivious to the fragile nature of their modern comforts, I spent my nights standing on the invisible, bleeding edge of modern digital warfare. The Aegis War Room was a cavernous space bathed in the cool, blue glow of massive tactical monitors, where the air hummed with the immense power of supercomputers processing petabytes of data every single second. My daily routine involved silently intercepting highly coordinated, multi-vector assaults from international hacker syndicates, neutralizing state-sponsored digital terrorist cells, and dismantling weaponized malware designed to cripple the American economy. The work I did was legally bound by security protocols so severe, so incredibly restrictive, that a single unauthorized disclosure, even a vague hint dropped at a cocktail party, could immediately result in federal treason charges and a lifetime in a black site military prison. Every single line of encrypted code I analyzed, every firewall I fortified, was directly tied to the survival of the critical infrastructure of the United States. We protected the municipal water treatment plants, the regional air traffic control grids, and the massive data centers of the global financial sectors. We were the invisible, silent shield keeping the modern world from collapsing into absolute chaos. To truly understand the gravity of what Marcus was blindly stumbling into with his petty lawsuit, you have to look back at a highly classified incident that occurred exactly 4 months prior to the reading of my mother's will. It was a Tuesday night, right around 2 o'clock in the morning. The operations floor was running on a skeleton crew when a massive, incredibly sophisticated ransomware strike silently breached the outer firewall perimeter of the Texas statewide Central Hospital network. This was not a standard, low-level financial shakedown orchestrated by amateur thieves. The hostile architecture was a weaponized zero-day exploit, specifically designed to infiltrate and completely paralyze the primary automated power grids of 47 major medical facilities across the entire state. The malware was programmed to simultaneously disable both their main municipal power feeds and their highly sensitive emergency backup generators. I was the primary architect on the terminal when our silent intrusion alarms triggered. The enemy's digital footprint was hyper-aggressive, spreading through the hospital network's vulnerable legacy systems like a digital hemorrhage. I had less than 12 minutes before the malware executed its final, irreversible lockdown sequence. If that malicious payload deployed, the power across 47 hospitals would completely and permanently fail. Thousands of critically ill patients relying on life-saving automated ventilators, fragile neonatal incubators, and computer-assisted surgical equipment would die in the dark before sunrise. It would be a mass casualty event of unprecedented, horrific proportions, creating a wave of panic that would paralyze the state. I instantly locked down my terminal, securing the physical doors to my sector, and engaged the threat independently. I did not even have the time to wake up the military chain of command or request authorization. For 9 agonizing, sweat-soaked minutes, I fought a brutal, silent war in the dark against an unseen, highly organized enemy. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard as I rapidly counter-hacked their proxy command servers. I systematically dismantled their complex encryption keys line by bleeding line, utilizing offensive algorithms I had written myself, and forcefully redirected their malicious payload into a sterile, heavily monitored digital quarantine zone. I successfully purged the hostile code and completely severed their connection to the Texas hospital grid with exactly 86 seconds left on the countdown clock. The entire catastrophic attack was crushed in absolute, total silence. The hospitals never experienced even a fraction of a second of power loss. The dedicated doctors, the exhausted nurses, and the thousands of vulnerable patients sleeping peacefully in their beds had absolutely no idea how terrifyingly close they had come to a massive, lethal tragedy. There were no breaking news headlines the next morning. There were no televised press conferences or public parades in my honor. My only reward was a highly classified, heavily redacted commendation letter from the Director of National Intelligence at the highest echelon of the federal government, personally thanking me for single-handedly averting a statewide disaster. That is the fundamental nature of the Aegis Sentinel Directive. We do our jobs perfectly. We save thousands of lives, and the world remains completely and blissfully unaware that we even exist. Now sitting alone in my suburban apartment and facing the vicious, impending legal assault from Marcus, a cold, terrifying reality began to set in. This was no longer just a pathetic, greedy family squabble over a trust fund and intellectual property. By aggressively dragging me into a highly public civil court, Marcus was inadvertently threatening to tear down the massive, reinforced firewall that separated my 2 lives. His high-priced, aggressive lawyers were going to relentlessly demand full legal discovery. They were going to subpoena my employment records, demand a decade of tax histories, and legally require me to produce verifiable, public proof of my daily activities to justify my financial competence to inherit the massive estate. Marcus smugly thought he was setting a clever, inescapable trap to expose a lazy, unemployed fraud. He had absolutely no idea that his petty, vindictive lawsuit was acting as a blind battering ram against the heavily fortified blast doors of a classified federal intelligence agency. If I submitted fake civilian documents to the court to appease him, I would be committing felony perjury and utterly destroying my mother's legacy. If I refused to provide the documents to protect my cover, Marcus would win a default judgment, seizing total control of the technology patents that he would undoubtedly exploit and ruin. But if the court somehow managed to forcefully pry open my actual background, it would trigger a catastrophic national security breach, exposing active operational protocols and unmasking the identities of covert operatives actively engaging hostile foreign threats. This was a direct threat to national security, disguised as a probate dispute. Marcus Thorne wanted to drag me out of the shadows and humiliate me under the blinding fluorescent lights of a courtroom. He wanted a war. I realized then that I had to protect my mother's legacy, but more importantly, I had to protect the absolute integrity of the directive. It was time to stop playing the quiet, submissive victim and start thinking like an apex predator. If Marcus desperately wanted a legal war, I was going to engineer a trap so flawlessly devastating that he would never see it coming until the steel jaws permanently snapped shut around his arrogant throat. The opening salvo of Marcus's legal campaign arrived exactly 3 days after the reading of the will. A process server ambushed me outside my apartment building, shoving a thick stack of aggressively worded court summons into my hands. Marcus had hired a notoriously ruthless corporate litigation firm, the kind that billed $1,000 an hour and specialized in financially bleeding their opponents dry before they ever stepped foot inside a courtroom. Their primary motion was a vicious, highly calculated masterstroke of legal maneuvering. They formally requested the court to issue a binding subpoena, demanding I immediately surrender a comprehensive decade of financial disclosures to prove my baseline competency to manage a multi-million-dollar estate. The legal demand included every single bank statement, a complete history of federal tax returns, and an exhaustive, verifiable employment record detailing my daily responsibilities and corporate supervisors. Marcus was absolutely certain he had successfully engineered an inescapable checkmate. In his mind, he had backed a terrified, unemployed fraud into an impossible corner, because my civilian identity was nothing more than a carefully fabricated phantom. None of those documents actually existed on any public grid. He knew that I could not produce a standard corporate pay stub or a conventional tax form. He confidently anticipated that I would either have to completely forfeit my mother's entire trust to avoid exposure, or desperately attempt to forge the documents and face immediate federal charges for perjury and criminal contempt of court. He was already celebrating his victory. I did not feel even a single ounce of panic as I read through the aggressive legal threats, instead of crumbling under the pressure. I calmly picked up my encrypted mobile device and placed a highly secure call to a woman named Valerie. Valerie was not a standard civil litigator. She was a fiercely intelligent, razor-sharp attorney who had previously served on the Supreme Legal Advisory Council for the Aegis Sentinel Directive. She was a woman who navigated the absolute darkest, most complex intersections of constitutional law and clandestine federal intelligence operations. When Valerie walked into my apartment later that evening, she did not bother offering useless sympathetic platitudes. She dropped her heavy leather briefcase onto my dining table, poured herself a glass of water, and began methodically dissecting Marcus's legal filings with the cold, clinical precision of a surgeon. "This is a classic brute force intimidation tactic," Valerie stated, her eyes quickly scanning the thickly bound legal pages. "He is trying to crush you with the sheer weight of discovery, assuming you have absolutely nothing to hide behind." I leaned back in my chair. "He wants to drag my entire employment history into a public courtroom. If I refuse to answer, I lose my mother's legacy. If I answer truthfully on the public record, I compromise the directive and violate federal treason statutes." Valerie offered a sharp, dangerous smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Then we do not refuse, Lila, and we certainly do not run. We are going to take your uncle's towering arrogance, and we are going to use the fundamental architecture of the judicial system to build a guillotine right over his head. We will give him exactly what he is demanding, but we will do it entirely on our terms. We immediately discarded the standard playbook of filing extensions or attempting to quietly settle out of court. Instead, Valerie and I drafted a highly classified petition and routed it directly through our encrypted channels to the absolute highest command echelon of the organization. We officially requested the extraction of a singular, heavily redacted employment verification dossier. This was not a standard piece of paper. It was a document classified at a level so high. Its very existence was a closely guarded secret. 48 hours later, a courier operating under federal armed escort delivered a solitary item to Valerie's secure office. It was a thick, heavy document sealed inside a completely unadorned black wax envelope. The black wax seal was the absolute highest legal standard for top secret, highly classified materials traversing the civilian justice system. The internal contents were cryptographically protected and bound by severe federal mandates designed to ensure that absolutely no one, not Marcus, not his expensive lawyers, and not the court clerks, could ever view it. The legal mechanism we engineered was flawlessly oppressive. The document was explicitly and legally designated to be opened only by the presiding judge of the trial, and it could only be unsealed and reviewed in a state of absolute total privacy. The trap was now fully set and primed. A massive, devastating storm was quietly gathering on the horizon, and Marcus Thorne was blindly marching his entire legal team straight into the eye of the hurricane, eagerly anticipating a slaughter that was meant exclusively for him. The morning of the preliminary hearing arrived with an oppressive, suffocating heat that seemed to seep through the heavy oak walls of the Travis County Courthouse in downtown Austin. Marcus did not just want a legal victory. He wanted a highly publicized, theatrical execution. He had actually hired a boutique public relations team to wait out in the hallways, and he dragged every single aunt, uncle, and condescending cousin into the gallery just to witness my public destruction. They sat in the wooden pews directly behind the plaintiff's table, whispering excitedly among themselves, dressed as if they were attending an exclusive daytime gala rather than a legal proceeding. At the front of the stifling room, the lead attorney for Marcus was putting on the performance of his career. He was a tall, excessively groomed man who paced aggressively back and forth across the polished hardwood floor, his voice booming with rehearsed righteous indignation. "Your Honor, what we have before us today is not a grieving daughter, but a highly calculating predator," the lawyer declared, dramatically gesturing toward where I sat. "The defendant is a phantom with absolutely no verifiable background. She has spent her entire adult life completely off the grid, living a dangerously fake existence, and utilizing calculated psychological manipulation to isolate and ultimately steal from her severely ill mother." He paused to let the venom of his words soak into the silent courtroom. With a smug, self-satisfied smirk, he pressed a button on a remote control, illuminating a large projector screen positioned next to the bench. "We subpoenaed the civilian employment records of the defendant for the past 10 years, the attorney announced, his voice practically dripping with theatrical disbelief. "Do you know what we found, Your Honor? Nothing. Absolutely zero. She possesses no valid pay stubs, no recognizable corporate job title, and no history of contributing to the civilian tax grid for a decade. She expects this court to hand over a multi-million-dollar technology empire to someone who does not even legally exist on paper." Throughout this agonizing, highly aggressive character assassination, I remained completely tethered to my silence. I sat perfectly upright at the defense table, my hands neatly folded together, breathing in a slow, measured rhythm. I kept my eyes locked forward, projecting an aura so profoundly calm and intensely still that when Marcus briefly glanced over his shoulder to gloat, I saw his smug smile falter. A sudden, involuntary chill seemed to wash over his face, a brief flash of primal instinct warning him that he had walked into a trap, but his towering ego immediately suffocated that instinct, and he quickly turned back around, shaking his head and laughing quietly with his lawyer. Presiding over this circus was Judge Caldwell. He was an older, deeply weathered man with a terrifying reputation. He was famous across the entire state of Texas for his absolute lack of patience. his zero-tolerance policy for courtroom theatrics, and his fierce hatred of liars. As the attorney continued to parade my lack of civilian documentation on the projector screen, Judge Caldwell began to scowl. The deep lines on his forehead tightened, and his knuckles turned white as he gripped his pen. He looked down at his docket, clearly agitated by the overwhelming lack of evidence presented by the defense. In the eyes of the court, I was failing to mount even a basic defense. I was providing no counter-arguments, no witnesses, and no financial records. The atmosphere grew incredibly heavy, suffocatingly tense, as Judge Caldwell finally leaned forward, his patience completely exhausted. He reached for his heavy wooden gavel, his eyes narrowing as he prepared to deliver a swift, devastating default judgment that would hand the entire legacy of my mother directly to Marcus. Right at that moment of absolute, terrifying tension, Valerie stood up. She did not scramble. She did not raise her voice in a desperate objection. She rose with a terrifyingly poised, aristocratic grace that instantly commanded the attention of every single person in the room. She calmly adjusted her tailored jacket and looked directly at Judge Caldwell. She did not offer a single word of verbal defense. Instead, she reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out the stark, completely unadorned black wax-sealed envelope. "Your Honor," Valerie said, her voice smooth and dangerously even. "The defense respectfully requests the bailiff to transfer this singular piece of physical evidence directly to your bench for your eyes only, in accordance with the highest federal executive mandates." The entire courtroom instantly fell into a dead, breathless hush. The bailiff, looking slightly confused by the highly irregular request, cautiously approached our table, took the heavy envelope, and carried it up the wooden steps to the judge. The lawyer representing Marcus immediately broke the silence, letting out a loud, mocking scoff that echoed against the high ceilings. He threw his hands up in the air, leaning heavily against the wooden podium. "Your Honor, I strongly object to this absolute circus," he sneered, pointing a mocking finger at Valerie. "This is nothing more than a desperate magic trick. It is a pathetic stalling tactic meant to buy time for a defendant who is drowning in her own lies. A wax envelope? Are we operating in the 18th century?" The family in the gallery erupted into a chorus of arrogant, hushed giggles, completely certain that this was the final, humiliating nail in my coffin. They thought they were watching a cornered rat frantically grasping at straws. They had no idea that the black wax seal resting on the desk of the judge was heavily embossed with the national emblem of the United States government, and that the courtroom was about to be hit by a legal earthquake so violent it would shatter their entire reality. Judge Caldwell did not even acknowledge the arrogant laughter echoing from the gallery. His stern eyes remained locked on the heavy black wax seal. With a sharp, practiced motion, he picked up a silver letter opener from his desk and cleanly sliced through the wax, breaking the federal seal. He slowly withdrew a single sheet of incredibly thick, heavily watermarked parchment. At first, his expression was one of profound skepticism. His brow furrowed as he scanned the opening lines of the highly classified document. Then, something extraordinary happened. The healthy color completely drained from the weathered face of the judge, leaving him a pale, ashen gray. His jaw tightened, and his experienced, steady hands actually began to visibly tremble. He was staring directly at the absolute highest security clearance authorization in the United States government, authenticated by the unmistakable, hand-signed signature of the Director of National Intelligence. Right below that signature was a heavily redacted operational summary, detailing the heroic actions of a single operative under the classified alias Silent Protector. The document detailed a specific date and a specific time, exactly 4 months prior. It outlined the silent, successful neutralization of a massive, coordinated cyber warfare strike, specifically targeting the automated power grid of the Texas Central Hospital Network. For a long, agonizing moment, Judge Caldwell simply stopped breathing. The severe, impartial mask of the magistrate, completely shattered, replaced by the overwhelming, raw emotion of a husband who had just realized a terrifying truth. On that exact night, at that exact hour, the wife of Judge Caldwell, was lying in the intensive care unit of that very hospital system, fighting for her life. She was entirely dependent on a complex, automated ventilator system to breathe. If that ransomware attack had succeeded, if the power had been severed for even 5 minutes, his beloved wife would not have survived the night. The revelation hit him with the force of a freight train. The silent, unassuming woman sitting at the defense table. The woman Marcus had spent the last hour aggressively degrading and humiliating was the sole reason his wife was currently alive and recovering at home. In an unprecedented move that completely defied every single rigid protocol of courtroom decorum, Judge Caldwell slowly pushed his heavy leather chair back. He stood up to his full height, his hands still shaking slightly. He meticulously adjusted the collar of his black judicial robe, stepped out from behind the towering wooden bench, and turned his body completely toward me. While the entire courtroom watched in absolute paralyzed shock, the notoriously strict, unyielding judge bowed his head deeply and solemnly in my direction, offering a profound, silent gesture of infinite gratitude. The courtroom plunged into a dead, suffocating silence. The mocking giggles from the gallery instantly died in their throats. The smug, high-priced lawyer froze mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open in utter confusion. Marcus looked as though all the air had been violently sucked out of his lungs. He collapsed back into his heavy wooden chair, his jaw dropping wide open. A thick layer of cold sweat instantly broke out across his forehead, rapidly soaking through the back of his expensive Italian suit. He did not understand the contents of the black envelope, but he possessed enough primal survival instinct to realize that he had just summoned an apocalyptic force he could not possibly comprehend or control. Judge Caldwell slowly returned to his seat, his eyes blazing with a newfound, terrifying righteous fury. He picked up his wooden gavel and slammed it down onto the sounding block with a deafening, explosive crack that made Marcus violently flinch. "This entire proceeding is an absolute disgrace," the judge roared, his voice echoing off the high ceilings like thunder. "This lawsuit is entirely baseless, built on malicious intent and egregious, fabricated slander. I am dismissing this case immediately, with extreme prejudice. Plaintiff is permanently barred from filing any future appeals regarding this estate." Marcus tried to stammer out a protest, his voice barely a weak, pathetic squeak, but the judge completely cut him off. "I am not finished with you, Mr. Thorne," Caldwell snarled, pointing his wooden gavel directly at the terrified man. "I am immediately signing a punitive order against you for the malicious exploitation and abuse of the judicial system. Furthermore, I am officially freezing every single one of your personal and corporate financial assets, effective immediately, pending a comprehensive, forensic federal investigation into your underlying financial motives and potential fraudulent activities. You are dismissed." It was an absolute unmitigated slaughter. The gallery erupted into frantic, panicked whispers. The wealthy, condescending relatives who had eagerly gathered to watch my public execution practically trampled over each other in their desperate rush to escape the courtroom. They kept their heads down, fleeing in absolute, crushing humiliation, not a single one of them daring to make eye contact with the silent niece they had spent years openly despising. They realized, far too late, that the sheep they had been ruthlessly mocking was actually a wolf in disguise. Several months later, the dust had fully settled. I was sitting at my fortified terminal deep within the underground command center of the Aegis Sentinel Directive, analyzing a fresh stream of encrypted threat data. The soft, blue light of the massive tactical monitors illuminated the cavernous room. My encrypted secure mobile device vibrated gently on the steel desk. I glanced down at the screen. It was a desperate, rambling text message from Marcus. His entire tech empire was currently collapsing under the sheer weight of the ongoing federal financial investigations. His assets were still locked down, and his wealthy friends had completely abandoned him. He was pathetically begging for a temporary financial loan from my mother's trust, promising to pay me back with interest, pleading for family loyalty. My face remained a mask of perfect, icy calm. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not type out a vindictive reply. I simply pressed the delete button, erasing his pathetic existence from my screen with a single, silent tap, returning my focus to the global security grid. Marcus Thorne finally learned the hardest lesson of all. True, ultimate power does not roar in a crowded ballroom, nor does it demand attention in an expensive suit. True power remains absolutely silent, operating entirely in the shadows, holding the fate of the world in its hands, while the fools mistakenly believe they rule the light. Thank you so much to everyone for tuning in and listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are all listening from, so please let me know in the comments below. If you thought today's story was incredible, please remember that YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, meaning we have absolutely no budget to continue uploading new videos here in the foreseeable future. We are transitioning our operations to Patreon, and we desperately need your help. Please support us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon community to hear the absolute best, longest, and most exclusive true stories that we simply cannot publish publicly on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the Patreon QR code currently on your screen, or by using the link provided in the description or the pinned comments. Thank you all once again.